Welcome to this November 2024 WMP case study class. My name's Kieran Doe. I'm a senior tutor at ACA Masters. When I sat the case study exam myself, I won the ICAEW prize for the highest score in the world. Several of my students have also won ICAEW prizes for their performance in the case study exam, including one student who also won the prize for the highest score in the world. This class is taken from my case study video course, so full details for the course can be found on the case study page of the ACA Masters website. So during this class, I'll be working through our first mock exam, and I'll be explaining how you should have interpreted the requirements and how you should have used the exam paper information in order to answer the requirement, and I'll demonstrate everything that you need to do. So how you should structure and approach the appendix, how you should approach each section of the report, the type of points you should include in each section, and how you should write your points in the exam. So I'll refer to my model answer for the mock exam and also the ICAEW style marking grids, which we provide for each mock exam. So during the course, I will also be referring to my pro forma report, which you can bring into the exam with you, which reminds you type of points to include for each section. And also my November 2024 AI analysis document, which summarizes the key points for each exhibit and analyzes the management accounts. So you've got them in a format ready to use for your appendix in the exam. So as I said, this class is taken from my case study video course. So this is the mock exam 1 debrief video. So in this class, which has been created for our YouTube channel, I'll be working through the first part of the class. So during this video, you'll see me work through requirement 1 only, but if you would like further details for the other classes in the case study course, then full details are available on our website. You will also find details here of the AI analysis document, which I just demonstrated, and also our mock exams, which are available. So each mock exam pack includes the mock exam, my model answer, and also the marking key. So we'll have the 3 requirements further down, and then what we'll have here is an explanation of what each exhibit includes. So we'll have what relates to requirement 1 here, and then what relates to requirement 2, and then requirement 3 here. So the exhibits for requirement 1 will be some narrative from the CFO about what's happened during the year. And then, of course, we'll have the management accounts themselves, which we will need to analyze. And then we've got the specific requirement here. So it's crucial that you pay attention to exactly what you are asked to focus on. So an analysis and explanation of financial and operating performance for the year compared to the previous year. So very typical requirement 1 there. So this is the bit to really focus on. You should cover revenue for each territory. So make sure you have a point on each territory there, and in total, as we always would, cost of revenue, gross profit, EBITDA, and cash. So a lot to do here in terms of the financial analysis. And then we can see here, use the draft management accounts as set out in the exhibit, incorporating as appropriate the KPIs and financial ratios we've already kind of incorporated those into the pro forma report. You definitely want to be commenting on those, whether they're specifically asked for or not, as well as the additional information, which you said will get that additional information, which will explain what has happened during the year. Now, we also need to respond to the request for advice. So there is a lot to do in this requirement one, a very full requirement one. So quite a challenging requirement one to do in the time, but it covers all the main areas. So straight away, when I'm reading this requirement, I'm thinking about how this is going to determine my headings in my report. I'm going to have a heading for each section. So revenue, cost of revenue and gross profit. You could kind of do those two together. Then we've got EBITDA and then cash. So there'll be the headings that I'll be using. So cost of revenue, gross profit, EBITDA, and then also cash as well. And then also, the specific request for advice, whatever that may be on, will also have its own heading. And then I also start to think about what the marking key will look like, so I can kind of gauge about how much I should write for each section. But in any event, you can't predict the marking key exactly. So in any case, we're going to be answering everything that they've asked for. So we have a heading on all of these points, as I've said. But as I've explained before, boxes on the left don't change, boxes on the right don't change. So it's only really these middle six that we need to be thinking about, what they will be. Revenue has always been worth, at least 2, and in almost all exams it's been 2 boxes. So I think we'll assume, that there will aim for about 5 mini paragraphs on revenue, which works quite nicely, of course, with this case study, because we'll have overall Europe, Middle East, Africa, Americas, Asia Pacific, and then mix. So that makes sense there. And then it's just thinking about how do we divide up these others. Well, request for advice would usually have its own 2 boxes here, but because there is so much else to do as well, that would mean they'd have to squeeze in gross profit, EBITDA, and cash into these 2 boxes. So it'd be likely that some of the points, probably for cash, would also fall into this box as well. But, like I said, it doesn't make too much difference, how you estimate it, whether you thought, EBITDA would be in here as well. In a way, it doesn't really matter too much, because, we need to answer every section. So we need to have that, in the report. And we need to make sure we get through, all of it. So we need to think about, how we're going to weight our time. And that's why it's useful to think about the marking key. We need to get through all of it. We're going to focus on the main numbers, the ones which have seen a significant change, and those which have a reason in the exam paper information. So don't spend too long, stressing about what the marking key might look like exactly, but it is worth it just to kind of keep this in your mind's eye for all requirements as you go through them. So we know how we're going to structure our report to make sure we answer and address everything the examiner has asked us to. And then, of course, we might have a high-level look at the information here, but we know we're going to get the information from the CFO, and we've got the major KPIs here. Presumably we'll have to calculate the ratios ourselves. And then we've got the business update, which will tell us reasons why things have gone up or down. We've told here new pay-in partners in UAE, some new destination countries as well, agreement with several new partners in the US. More established corridors have seen higher levels of activity. They have a higher value. So we can kind of see these are just reasons why the numbers and ratios and KPIs will have changed during the year. Then we've got the request for advice, which is short. So that would be another indicator that might not be worth a full 2 boxes, but usually it would. The default would be that would have 2 boxes by itself. And then, of course, we've got the management accounts, which is, absolutely as we'd expect, and where we're going to be focusing on our analysis on calculating the numbers. So we've got all of that here, including the notes, which of course we know we are going to need. So, personally, I prefer to do it one section at a time. So I'll do my numbers for revenue, and then I'll write up my revenue section, and then do gross profit numbers, then write it up, etc. So I start with the appendix first of all, and of course you could decide that you want to have a read through all of this to understand what's happened in the year, or you might decide that you want to kind of skim it and then come back and read it in detail, or read it in detail first of all. It's entirely up to you. It is a matter of preference, and obviously practice as you go through and as you do the mock exams. You'll decide on which method works best for you. But I generally like to have a high level look, so I know I've got some of the numbers I'm going to need here to calculate the KPIs. This is a reason here why EMEA will have gone up, new partners in the UAE, first non-European country into that territory. They've added a few other countries on as destination countries, which along with some existing destination countries prove popular with UAE as a send country. So that'll be a reason why EMEA will have gone up. So we'd expect to see that number go up. To help establish the brand, undertook marketing campaigns. So that would be a reason why marketing expense has gone up. Like we said, reached agreement with new partners in the US. So that would be a reason why America's revenue has gone up, because that helped them expand presence in the region. And like we've seen as well, most established corridors saw higher levels of activity. And they have higher average transaction values. So that would be a reason why average transaction value, will have gone up, or we would have expected it to go up. There's been an increase in prices partway through the year. So for 9 months of the year, they've had higher prices, overall prices, and they've negotiated lower fees and longer payment terms with main partners. So that would be a reason why partner and bank fees have gone down, and also payables may have gone up, because remember, we need to analyze cash as well. So we've got challenging economic conditions meant that we had to set up provisions for several payout partners who are in financial difficulty. So provisions are there in those net credit losses. Reduced volatility in currencies, maybe lower FX costs. So you can kind of see here, then there was like an issue with the compliance system, accuracy of the machine learning algorithm to forecast cash. So possibly some impairments if we're told about that, but we're actually told, recruit several new employees. That would be a reason why employee expenses have gone up. This would be a reason why settlement assets have gone up, and therefore bad for cash. Perhaps an issue with compliance here as well. We're told about employee expenses capitalized, and then we're told in terms of cash flow, they move partners from pre-funding to post-funding where possible, which is obviously good for cash. So we'll see an increase in those. We'll see a change, we'll see a reduction in the settlement assets there, but also an increase in payables, so settlement obligations. So we can kind of see as you read through each point, where that is going to be useful. So you may decide to have that read through before you analyze the numbers, maybe kind of quite high level, or you may decide to read it in detail and then come back to the numbers. It is a matter of preference. Quite often they lay it out in a friendly way so that you have more of the revenue stuff at the top and more of the costs further down, but not always, and there's no obligation for them to do that. But if they do it that way, then of course you could obviously just read the first few points and then do your revenue section. But I would say, in my opinion, probably worth having at least a skim through it all so you know what's happened. And then I would leave a request for advice separate, and then come to that when you attempt it. So then in terms of calculating the numbers, you're going into the exam with your AI analysis. So therefore you could, put those numbers in first of all. That's something I quite like to do. What I do is I put in the prior year numbers, put the formula in here, obviously, auto sum. But then, rather than just hard typing in the mixed numbers, just recalculate them in the software. So obviously EMEA, this over total. And then you can just make sure that the formulas, you've set them up correctly, because that will obviously give you the same answer as you have in your AI analysis. And then you can kind of drag it over for 24, copy it over for 24. There's one way of doing it. Like I said, there's different ways you could go about it, but that's how I do it. So again, you can put in all your 2023 numbers, like volume of transactions, type that in, but then revenue per transaction, you could have that in there as a formula. Then you've got your value of transactions, your average transaction value, which you could then calculate with the formula, and then just obviously sense check it back to here. And then take rate, again, you could set up the formula for that. And again, number of customers, hard type that in, but then set the formula up for that. So once you've kind of got your 2023 numbers in, then you can put your 2024 numbers in, which you obviously get from the exam paper. So we've got some of the KPI numbers here. You may decide that you want to kind of put all of those in first of all, and then obviously go down to the accounts to put the revenue figure in. But more usefully is note one. More useful is note one. So you've got all of the numbers here for each region. So you can kind of put those in, but again, just sense check them. Once you get your change, does that look correct? Based on the movement there, obviously, that does look sensible, that figure, and then calculate percentage. And again, sense check that. Is that roughly a 25% addition there? Clearly, it is. And then, of course, you calculate your mixed numbers in the same way as you did for 23. And then, as we've just said, revenue per transaction is derived from revenue and volume. Value of transactions will help you get to your average transaction value, and you can work out your take rate using the same method as the AI and the average revenue per user. So not too bad in terms of revenue. There's not quite so much to calculate as there perhaps has been in other case study exams, but there is a lot of analysis around the financial ratios and the KPIs that we can do. So as you're going through and calculating the numbers, when you're looking at that number, does that look sensible? You can also think, is that kind of what I would expect from the narrative that I've read? Well, if you get a 40% increase, 39.9% increase in EMEA, we of course know there's been the 4 new partners in UAE. So therefore, you may decide that you want to kind of plan this out. We've already thought what our revenue section would look like. We'll have overall, then the 3 regions, and then something on mix. You may decide you want to use this plan, use this pro forma report, and just note on here your reason, for X UAE, something like that. Just a quick note to think, well, that's where I'm going to use that point, or that's my reason for there. Obviously, with America's, reason is, the new partners. Don't think we were told anything about Asia Pacific, so maybe we won't have a kind of a specific reason there. But yet, these numbers kind of make sense with what we have been told. We were told as well that there's been a price increase in the year, and we were told average transaction values have gone up. So obviously, average transaction value has gone up. So that's the amount customers are transferring, and obviously most of the fees are variable, so therefore that's going to feed into revenue per transaction, and also the overall price increase is feeding into that revenue per transaction as well. So that's kind of consistent. We would expect to see an increase in average revenue per transaction and also average transaction value, and because of the price increase, we'd expect to see take rate go up. And these factors, like the price increase, like the average transaction value, would also be causing an increase in average revenue per user. But that's actually gone down. But once again, as we've seen, in the AI, the number of customers is going up faster than revenue. So actually, to generate that revenue, they're needing even more customers. So you can see that's why, average revenue per user is going down. And what can be quite useful to look at is, average transaction per customers. If you've got the number of transactions and the number of customers, then we can see actually the average transaction per customer is declining, on average. So that would be a contributing factor there as to why it's going down, because everything else suggests that that should be going up. Customers are transacting more value. Prices have gone up. You'd expect revenue per customer to be going up, but it's not. It's going down, and you can kind of see here with the change in the number of customers compared to revenue, you can see that it's increasing faster than that. And because you've got the number of transactions, you could look at average transaction per customer as well. Probably not essential because it's not a stated KPI in the AI, but it is just a useful metric, and you might have thought of other metrics that you could look at as well. But definitely don't go overboard on calculating extras, but it's just kind of quite useful to give you some reasoning why that's changing or going down when everything else is creating an increase in that figure. So we've then thought about, what our sections would be, what our reasons would be. Most of this will just be kind of slotting the numbers in. We'd have our mix there. So you can go back to the narrative and just think, okay, so what am I told about revenue and where am I going to feed this in? We've used all of this information in our analysis of the numbers, and we'll be bringing that in. So we've got the new partners which we've brought in, and we can tie that in with the destination countries as well. What this is really all saying is that revenue from UAE and therefore EMEA has gone up because of the new partners in UAE. This is the reason why Americas is going up. This is the reason why transaction values are higher. So you could be kind of scribbling those on. As we said, we could scribble those in there, where we've got a point in here about the average transaction value. Here we've got a reason for this here. So more transactions in corridors with higher transaction values, which is why that is going up. Increase in overall prices, so that would be increasing revenue per transaction, and also higher transaction values will be increasing revenue per transaction, and that will also be increasing the take rate as well. And then it more gets onto expenses, provisions, fees, employees. So I think that's mainly it. I think we've picked up all of the revenue reasons here. So then we're ready to kind of write up our section. We've got our plan. We know where we're putting the points on. So there we can start typing up our revenue section. So a lot to do, obviously, for overall revenue. The regions are a bit more kind of straightforward, number up or down with the reason. If there are any further insight points, we can bring those in. So with overall revenue, say whether it's gone up or down, give some opinion. Is it impressive? Is it disappointing? Is it significant, etc.? I like to have the number and the percentage here. Usually you can have either or in the marking key, but if you've got both in there, then it's kind of a bit of a sail face to make sure that if you did have a typo, that you'd still pick up the other one. So a bit of a backup measure there. So we have, and I also like to give the absolute figure, even though you technically don't need to. It's then useful to compare that to the forecast, which you should most definitely do. So revenue's gone up, which is impressive, but it is below the forecast. Then give some market context. So because the C2C transaction growth is expected to be this, you may say, that it's possibly disappointing, or they could be on track to kind of exceed the market. But what I've said here is, despite the growth in the market, there are difficult economic conditions, so that may have had a negative impact. So the fact that the rate of growth is increasing, so definitely compare it to prior year growth, and that's obviously exceeded prior year growth. And then we can get on to analysing some of the KPIs and the ratios. Volume of transactions was up by 17.3%. And then again, I would compare that to the forecast. It's just above the forecast. And then, there's different ways you could do it. You could do value now and do the average value. But personally, the way I like to look at it is to look at, well, this is the total revenue. This is the number of transactions. This is revenue per transaction. So, total revenue is a mixture of volume and price. This is essentially, the price revenue per transaction, and this is the volume. So, we can see here volume of transactions up by 17.3%, and revenue per transaction has also increased. So higher volume and a higher price, but again, it's still below the forecast. And then I'll come on to look at average transaction value, which has increased. And then of course that is, a combination of, the reason numerically is because, the value of transactions has gone up faster than the volume. So just specifically mentioned those two numbers there. Why is that? Why is the value going up faster than the volume, i.e. why is average value going up? Well, of course, we were told in the AI, high levels of transactions in more established corridors, which have higher average values. So, of course, we know that's contributed to the increase in revenue per transaction. Obviously, we know from the AI, if customers are sending higher transaction amounts, and this is going to result in higher revenue per transaction because most of the fees are, of course, variable. So that would be a reason there why revenue per transaction is going up. But there's also been a higher price as well. So they've increased overall prices as opposed to the previous year when they'd had, of course, that price promotion. So we could say, this increase in average value has contributed to the increase in revenue per transaction. And it also causes an increase in average revenue, per user, is increasing the revenue that they're getting, from each transaction. However, that has actually fallen. So that would explain why it's gone up, and that has, caused some of an increase, but that figure's actually fallen. So we'll come on to why that was in a minute. But we could also say, because both of these metrics are also affected by the overall price increase. So both revenue per transaction and average revenue per user are both affected by the overall price increase. So I would mention that. We've already explained how that would affect take rate, but that would affect both of those as well. But average revenue per user is also affected by the number of transactions per customer. So that's kind of the metric which isn't in the AI, which you can calculate, which gives an indication of why that, another reason why that figure might be changing. So they mentioned specifically, the increase in the number of customers. So again, kind of, numerically, why is average revenue per user going down? Well, revenue is obviously going up by this, and the average number of customers is going up by more than that. So you could mention, that as well, or you could delve into it a bit more by looking at number of transactions per customer. And then, of course, as I said, with the take rate, that's gone up, and that's because of the price increase. How much of the transaction value is WMP taking as its revenue, and that's obviously gone up because of the fee increase. And you could comment on whether all territories have had an increase or only some. That's kind of quite a useful trend point to pick up. So there is a lot to do in terms of going through the KPIs and explaining why they've changed. There's different ways you could structure this paragraph. Like I've said, I've tried to do it like this to try and be as efficient as possible whilst being thorough and getting through them all. So kind of, explaining, this affects both of them, for example, that helps save a bit of time about the price increase. But there's definitely different ways you structure this. All I would say is, make sure you get through, you incorporate all of the main ones, because there will be marks in there for all of them. And we can see, the overall revenue here, but, lots of points in the revenue boxes are for looking at, the KPIs and the financial ratios, which you may or may not have to calculate the financial ratios. They may give them to you, they may not. But you can see, as I've said, overall revenue, compare it to the forecast. Is the rate of growth increasing or decreasing? We've got the figure here, total revenue, lower than last year, below the forecast. So we pick up a few AJ points there. And then looking at the volume and the value, just kind of a simple numerical point there. And then they've kind of moved on and then looked at, average value, revenue per transaction, so average revenue per transaction. Then we've got, average transaction value, revenue per transaction, the take rate. So you can see as long as you've kind of got them all in there with the reason, it doesn't really matter, how you structure it. But I just felt like this was a fairly succinct way of doing it while still being thorough. But obviously you're adapting it every time for, what's actually happened, during the year. And then of course we go through the territories, which is easier really. It's, has it gone up or down with the number, with the reason, and then give some further insight. So EMEA has gone up impressively by this. That's the number. That's nice and easy. A nice easy mark here for getting the number. The reason is also fairly easy. We're just picking it up from the exam paper. So quite often you get the reason point in here, possibly in here as well, but it's ended up in here. Still a mark. It doesn't really matter which box it's on. It was an obvious point from the exam paper. You're getting a mark for it. It doesn't matter which box you get the mark in. It's worth, 1 mark or, half a mark. So there we are. And then I try and always give some further insight. This is the fastest growing region. Whereas America, I've said, it's got the highest absolute growth. You can see that, it might have the lowest growth in percentage terms, but it's got the highest absolute growth. So, they're kind of some like further insight points. The easy bit is the number up or down by this, with the reason, that's nice and easy. You usually get like a mark or two for that. This is being backslash, well, I've already got the mark. So in a way it's unfortunate, but kind of like I said earlier, in terms of having like a fail safe, it's good there. And then sometimes we kind of get these further insight points. It might be on there, there might not. Probably just wasn't room on the marking key for, comparing the performance of the different regions. And then mix, fairly easy here, the change in revenue, but then give some analysis of it. So, what does this show? Well, America is decreasing, but it's still, the largest. So you could say, it's continued importance of Americas or resurgence of EMEA. But you can see here it was just for the numbers. And obviously with Asia Pacific, there wasn't really we weren't told anything about it. There was no reason. So I kind of struggled there in terms of thinking, what else am I going to say? But that's fine. I'm not going to spend lots of time sitting here thinking, well, there's not a reason from the exam paper. It's not the fastest growing. It's not the slowest growing. It's not that significant. So therefore that's fine. I'll move on, make sure I move on within time. There was a lot to do here. And you can see, picked up all of the marks here. The point on comparing it to the forecast was here. A point about, the industry was here. So you can kind of see, really thorough revenue section there. Got through that fairly quickly, more or less as efficiently as you could do it, but then picking up all the marks as well. So keeping the time down, picking up the marks, which comes really just from practicing their technique with mock exams. So the next section that we needed to address is cost of revenue and gross profit. It makes sense to do those two together because obviously the cost of revenue feed into gross profit. So again, we could start by putting in our prior year numbers, which we can get from our AI analysis. So we've got those all there. And then we'll just go to the exam paper and then pick up the numbers, which again, of course, are in the notes. So we've got those there in the breakdown of expenses. So we can put those numbers in and then calculate the movements. Again, just sense checking them to make sure that they look sensible. And then looking at these costs as a percentage of revenue is useful to do because, of course, we know that scale is key in this business, and therefore, as the business grows, they should be able to reduce the costs as a percentage of revenue. And we can see that's happening here. Bank and partner fees, they're reducing as a percentage of revenue. And then we can see here as well the net credit losses. Even though both of these costs have increased, they're reducing as a percentage of revenue because revenue is growing faster than those costs. And of course, FX has actually reduced, so that's significantly decreasing as a percentage of revenue. And of course, we know a KPI, or key financial ratio, is looking at cost per transaction, which has decreased. So really good news for the gross profit margin because revenue per transaction has increased, cost per transaction has decreased, and therefore we can see that feeding through into the gross profit margin. So again, you may decide that you want to, have a little plan here. Again, we don't want to necessarily go through and comment on every single expense line because we've got a lot to do. We also need to do cash as well and the request for advice. So if you are pushed for time, then you could just focus on the ones which have had the most significant change, or there's a reason in the exam paper as to why it has gone up or down. And of course, we are given some reasons in the exam paper. For example, we were told here about lower fees with partners. So therefore, that would be a reason why cost per transaction, has decreased. And of course, also why bank and partner fees haven't increased by as much as revenue. We were told that they needed to set up some provisions. We've got a reason there why net credit losses have increased, and then reduce volatility in the currencies in which they operate. So again, we can see why that has decreased. So actually, because we've got a reason in the exam paper for each of them, ideally we would comment on all of them. And then, of course, we can look at the gross profit margin and again, focus on why that margin has changed. But obviously, we can see revenue per transaction is increasing faster than cost of revenue per transaction, which has actually decreased. So in quite a similar way to revenue, we're just going through each of the costs one by one. So bank and partner fees increase with the number, and then say what it is as a percentage of revenue. And then we can give a reason as well. So we've kind of got a number, a bit of further analysis, and then also the reason. So quite similar to revenue, number and reason being the key bit here. So FX had obviously decreased because of the lower volatility, and now we've got it as a percentage of revenue is now lower. And if you've got any context points, and as we've got here, increasing scale narrows currency spreads. And then net credit losses again, number with the reason from the exam paper, and then some further analysis, so as a percentage of revenue. And you can see we're doing the same thing, so we're just picking up the marks here as we go. So bank and partner fees number, and then the reason from the exam paper. And we can see these two were combined together. So we'd get the mark, and we did both, but we can see here we've got the number and then the reason. So then we get down to the cost of revenue per transaction. So we've seen it's decreased. What was the reason? Well, the scale has increased negotiating power with partners. The fee per transaction has now decreased. As we were told there, they negotiated better fees. And this is worse than the forecast still. So even though it's a good improvement, that it has decreased, it is below the forecast. And then with gross profit overall, up or down, I like to give the absolute figure here for key headline numbers like revenue, gross profit, and EBITDA. I guess it's not really essential to get the mark. compare the growth to the previous year as we did with revenue. So this is faster growth than the previous year, but then focus on the margin. We can see that the margin has increased. Why is the gross profit margin increasing? Well, revenue is increasing, put simply, revenue is increasing faster than cost. And you can, on a per transaction basis, revenue per transaction increasing, cost of revenue decreasing. So of course, they're making more gross profit on each transaction. But we could also have some other reasons here. The reason that the revenue per transaction is going up faster than the cost of revenue is because there's a higher average transaction value. So the transaction value is higher, and that's driving the increase in higher revenue per transaction. And of course, there was a price increase. So again, another reason why revenue increased without an associated increase in cost. And of course, the higher scale. So gross profit margin now seems to be on an upward trend. So it seems to be increasing, because that's obviously an increase in the previous year as well, as we knew from the AI. So again, revenue per transaction was increasing and cost per transaction was decreasing, and partly because of the higher average transaction value. You can see here how we go through, pick up the gross profit marks. There's also a mark there for the cost per transaction for calculating that. And then we would do the same thing with the admin expenses, which make up EBITDA. So remember, if you're commenting on the EBITDA, you won't be commenting on changes in amortization and depreciation, unless they specifically ask you for admin expenses, which they didn't in the requirement. It was asking for EBITDA. So again, we'd go through and calculate them. But if you do have any numbers which aren't that significant, then maybe you wouldn't comment on them if you were pushed for time. So employees is the key one. That's the biggest one. And we can do some more analysis here. We can see that the employee costs have gone up, but it's useful and meaningful to look at that on a kind of cost per employee basis. And remember, some of the costs are capitalized. So therefore, to get the total amount, you need to take the P&L amount, which we pick up obviously from the breakdown in the P&L, but also we need to get the amount which is being capitalized, which will presumably be told in the narrative. So we get the P&L amount, but then also the amount that we were told in the narrative around the amount which was capitalized. And therefore, we get the total employee costs. We can get the number of employees from the notes, and then we've got the cost per employee. And therefore, we can see how that's increased or not, and it's obviously increased significantly. So we'd seen there was a reason for that in the exam paper. So I would definitely be looking at this metric and commenting on it when you comment on employee costs. And if you've got a reason in the exam paper as to why that was, more recruitment of senior staff as well, then that would explain that change, that significant increase. And then with some of the others, we were told marketing that had gone up because of the campaigns in Dubai. But we know from the AI that once the brand is established, that should reduce. IT, that's increased, maybe possibly because of some of this additional work that needed to be done around the algorithm and the compliance system. We're not sure what was capitalized, and we're not going to go into the detail of IS 38 here because that's not the purpose of the case study exam. These are, of course, management accounts, so don't need to be entirely compliant, and we're told that their policy for capitalization has been approved by the auditor. So not too much of a significant movement. We don't have any reason as to why it had changed. So perhaps would leave that one out. But you can see, costs are done in exactly the same way as with when we looked at cost of revenue and gross profit. Total employee costs due to recruitment of senior staff. So again, number, reason, further analysis looking at it as a percentage of revenue, or more importantly here, further analysis in terms of looking at the cost per employee and the reason why that had increased. But again, we're just looking at a different layer of costs, so we're still approaching these costs in the same way. So we've got employee costs, cost per employee, and there we've got that bit there, and you can see the other costs all there in exactly the same way. So again, marketing up, reason, further analysis, and like a context point, it can be reduced once the brand is established. So it's higher now, but hopefully that will reduce once they are established in UAE. And then with IT, it wasn't really a specific reason for the exam paper. Like I said, you could have mentioned about the work on the algorithm and the compliance, but it's decreasing as a percentage of revenue, which shows that it's been well controlled. So then when we look at EBITDA, similar to when we looked at gross profit margin, you can look at the costs as a percentage of revenue, are they decreasing? Well, actually, the amount in the P&L for the employees is reducing as a percentage of revenue. IT is, other is, marketing's increased. But you can see, once combined with the increase in the gross profit margin, some of these cost savings or these kind of scale benefits, these costs aren't increasing as much as revenue is. It's only really marketing, which is, so all of these other costs reducing as a percentage of revenue, and therefore there was also the same when looking at costs of revenue. That's resulted in a healthier EBIT margin. So that would be one reason for the increase in EBITDA. So we've said, again, give the absolute figure, it's increased by this amount. And obviously if they've had a good year, that's going to be a substantial increase. Of course, because we're starting from a low base. Compare it to the forecast. So it's a good improvement, but still below the forecast. Margin has increased. So why has the margin increased? Well, there's IT and other costs reducing as a percentage of revenue due to the increased scale. And then some of it is because of those gross profit margin improvements just feeding through down into the EBITDA line. But then, of course, we've got the employee costs. So even though employee costs in total increases a percentage of revenue, the amount in the P&L, which of course affects EBITDA, had actually decreased as a percentage of revenue. And therefore, the margin has continued its upward trend. So it's been a good year, but still below forecast. So once we've worked through EBITDA, a lot of the scale benefits there kind of feeding through like they did with the gross profit. And it picks up IT as well. So you can see you've picked up all of these marks in this box. So the next section that we needed to analyze was cash. Probably the easiest way to do this is to go to the cash flow statement. And I would firstly look at the headline number, which is the net change in cash during the year. And we can see that the company failed to generate a positive cash flow. We're told in the AI that they were expecting to. So we can see here negative cash flow for the year. And I would probably start with that in my first piece of analysis. So net cash declined slightly because it is a slight decline, and I'd give what the cash balance is now. So we could say, so the milestone of generating a positive cash flow has not been met. And then there's a bit of further analysis, maybe saying this would be a concern for Hamilton, perhaps, and potential other investors if they were looking to raise additional finance. And then in terms of analysing what has caused this decline, again, cash flow statement will be where we'll be looking at here. But really, similar to the previous years, the main numbers are going to come from the change in settlement assets and other receivables, settlement obligations, trade payables and other current liabilities, and then also the acquisition of assets. So here we can see there's been a significant addition of intangible assets. Because we start with the accounting profit, add back depreciation and amortization. So we're almost at kind of like a cash from operations figure there. Obviously the finance income just nets off if what's actually been received is the same as what was accrued. And then if PP investment is small, then obviously these are the main numbers. So they've started with quite a healthy cash from operations figure here. And actually you can see these two almost net off. So really it's the additions to intangible assets. But we know, of course, that investing in innovation and new technology to help automation and to help scale up is essential for the business. We can make that point as well. We won't say it's all negative that they've invested in assets. So you can take these one by one, and you can look, obviously these are made up of several amounts. We know that we've got the breakdown between settlement assets and other receivables. That's in the notes here. So we've got the settlement assets. So we've got the breakdown here between the amounts which are pre-funding amounts, so the advances to pay our partners, and then we've got the cash due from the third-party acquirers like the banks, etc. So we've got that figure there, and then we've got the other receivables on the face of the SFP. And then for the liabilities, we've got the breakdown on the face of the SFP. So just make sure you're comfortable with where things are. So if you do want to do a detailed analysis of the two numbers rather than looking at them as a whole, you can do so. So we can see here that we can pick up that change in the two figures. So we've got the movement on the receivables. We saw that cash flow as an outflow and increase in the receivables, and then effectively as an inflow here the payables, because they've increased payables, so haven't paid the suppliers, the partners. So we can see the figures there, but you can just break it out between the different amounts. Obviously the cash flow statement presents them as a single amount. So if there was a specific change in a particular item, then obviously doing this analysis will let you pick that up. We can see here that other receivables didn't move much, but the pre-funding amounts went up the most. And of course, we know there was an issue with the machine algorithm. We were told that in the exam paper. And of course, you need this figure as well to calculate the cash advances day. Definitely a financial ratio you should be calculating in the exam, and we'll weave this into our analysis. So we've got those figures there, that breakdown there. And then, of course, we can see settlement obligations increased. That caused most of the increase in the payables. And we knew from the exam paper that there was a shift to post-funding as well. So there are different ways you could structure your analysis for the cash. I mean, I would probably do it, say what the cash inflow or outflow was for the year and see how that compared to the previous year. So settlement assets and other receivables, the outflow is this. If you've got on the pro forma report, what it was in the previous year, which you'll have, then it's easy to just quickly work out, how different is that from, the previous year. And that was due to increased volume, would explain part of that. But then obviously we can do the cash advances days here, and we can see that has increased. And we've got the reason from the exam paper, the issues with the machine learning tool, and then we also have got this 2-day target as well, which we've got from the AI. So not too dissimilar really from when we're analysing revenues and kind of what changed. What's the reason from the exam paper, some further analysis, which we can do a lot here with the settlement assets, because we've got the cash advances days we can calculate, and then we've got the 2-day limit, so we can see that this ratio is not being met. But again, you've got the pro forma report to kind of give you the structure here. So then with the settlement obligations, trade payables and other payables, we can see that the inflow here on the cash flow statement. So that's, the amount was fairly small the previous year. So that's a significant increase. You'd probably calculate that number a few times just to make sure that definitely is correct. Due to better terms with partners, which again, we were told from the exam paper, why have trade payables gone up? Well, better terms with partners is increasing the trade payables. And of course, the move to post-funding was increasing the settlement obligations. And then we can make that point here that, moving to post-funding helps cash flow, but it's worse for customer service. So that's a kind of a commercial consideration here. This is good for cash, but obviously potentially bad for customer service. And of course, you could look at the trade payables increase, compared to the increase in bank fees, but we are told that other payables are in there as well. So we're not sure if it is entirely due to that, but we can see here that's making up most of it. Then obviously that has increased by more than the bank and partner fees. So that's kind of reflecting those better payment terms. But there are some other payables in there as well, we think, or the name seems to suggest. So calculating the trade payables days might not be accurate, and it isn't in the AI. So then we've got the capex on the intangibles outflow. So we've got this amount as a 60.6% increase on the previous year due to the staff costs which were capitalised for the compliance system and the machine learning tool. Presumably, we told they've recruited more senior staff to help deal with that, and then we've seen an increased amount of employee expenses capitalised during the year. So the trend of increasing intangibles capex has continued. So, like I said earlier, there's a positive side to that. Yes, it is an investment. It's bad, not necessarily bad for cash, but it's obviously a cash outflow. So it's using up cash, but that should help improve EBITDA in the future because it will help increase automation and reduce costs. And we've got that context point there about the industry. So in a very similar exam technique here, and you'll end up picking up marks, in the same way on the cash boxes. So you can see, go out, pick out the main amounts. Obviously, headline number, the cash flow, it's an outflow. Then we've got marks here for the settlement assets, and for some further analysis, the evaluation by looking at the cash advances days. And then again, we can see here, like better partner terms, the intangible assets, etc. So, similar exam technique. I know analysing cash, might not have been as frequently examined perhaps in some of the earlier exams, and it comes up rarely as well in case study. But the technique, isn't too different. What are the main numbers that have driven the change? Reasons for that, ideally coming from the exam paper, and of course any further analysis that you can do. So a quite short request for advice where we were told that one of our partners is under investigation for facilitating money laundering. They've got operations in the UK and overseas, and they've been closed until further notice. We've been unable to contact the management team using the details we hold for them, which may suggest that the details aren't correct, or it might just be that they're not responding. So at this point, we do not have any further details on the matter. Please advise us on the factors that WMP should consider when deciding how to deal with the issue and any actions that should be taken. Quite standard there for a request for advice. What are the issues? And of course, what action should be taken. So there aren't really any numbers to calculate. There's a lack of information here, but we could mention what we know about the issues involved. Obviously, using the payment system for crime was something mentioned in the AI. The significance on it, the impact on the accounts, possibly have to write off any pre-funding amounts given to that partner, if any. The impact on the business as well. So we can obviously link this back to the risks. So always thinking back to that risk register. So risks of illegal use and the need to maintain controls previously identified, and this issue relates to both. So just saying how the issue relates to items we already know about from the AI. So then, what are the main issues and factors that they should consider? Well, it's highly regulated, so several authorities, may investigate. They may request information from WMP, may investigate whether WMP undertook sufficient procedures. such as KYC verification. And then, like we said, in terms of a financial impact, then any settlement assets may need to be written off. And then we can come up with some sensible recommendations, be helpful with the regulators, identify any amounts which are due from that partner, legal advice, and ensure that there's proper documentation to support the controls which were and procedures which were undertaken with this specific partner. So as I said, usually the request for advice would have its own two boxes, but this was quite a small one, and there was cash in there as well as having to do EBITDA, gross profit, and revenue. So it's kind of squeezed into here. But like I said, it doesn't matter too much. If EBITDA was squeezed into here as well, less of these points would be backslash. So you can't predict it entirely. As long as you answer everything, then you will score very well, as you can see, as I have done here. And even if you didn't get a few points on the request for advice, you still would have done well on this question if you've got a good, thorough analysis of the financial statements. So then all that's left to do is the conclusions and the recommendations. So remember, the conclusions, you need a point on every section that you've been asked for. So if we've been asked for revenue by territory and in total, cost of revenue, gross profit, EBITDA, cash, and the request for advice, you need 1 point on each of those in the conclusion. So, of course, in the conclusions, we're not going to have anything new which isn't elsewhere in the report. The facts are the facts. Overall revenue has gone up by this to this, and that's below, the forecast. That's the key headline number for overall revenue. That's a fact. Even if you rewrote that from scratch, it wouldn't be much different, if at all, from what's here. So therefore, you could take this point, you could copy it and drop that into your conclusions. And then we also need a point on revenue by each region. So again, I would just take the main point. So the number it's gone up by and maybe a brief reason why. You're not copying the whole thing. You shouldn't be copying large chunks of the report into the conclusion. We're just taking the main number. So therefore, I've taken a point on overall revenue, and I've taken a point on each of the regions, because that's what the question asked for. And I've also included some of the KPIs in there. Not everything from above, but a few of the main headline points, because they are obviously key financial ratios and KPIs for the business. And then similarly with cost of revenue, I just took the main point. It didn't ask the cost of revenue by each line, it just asked for it in total. So I just took the first point I had in cost of revenue, which is just saying what the increase is and whether it was due to an increase in all costs. And then I've got my point on gross profit, again, just my first point from my section above. My first point on EBITDA, and my first point on cash, and then my main point on the issue. So I've just taken the main point. Now, overall revenue, that's the key headline number for revenue. Cost of revenue, that's the key point there for cost of revenue. EBITDA and net cash at the main point in each of those. So then for the recommendations, just think of some sensible action points based on what's happened in the scenario. So we obviously know that revenues increase. It's been a successful year, so it's still below forecast. But what's made this year good? Well, they've added some new countries and created new corridors. So find partners in more countries to create more corridors. Would be good. Obviously, revenue per transaction has gone up because of the higher transaction value. So it could change the pricing perhaps to encourage higher transaction values. Focus marketing on corridors which have higher transaction values. As we've seen, that's had a benefit this year. We've seen gross profit margin and EBITDA improving because revenue per transaction is going up, partly because of the higher average values we've just explained, but also, the cost have gone down as well. So costs have decreased. We've seen cost per transaction decrease because of the better rates with partners to negotiate even better rates. There was an issue with the credit loss provisions and more due diligence on partners, perhaps. We saw some of the KPIs go down to investigate why average revenue per user keeps going down. More of a generic one here about the suitability of the KPIs. So staff costs are going up, so invest in automation to reduce staff. And then some of the points as well around cash. So I think it's easy to get quite a lot of recommendations in requirement one. We've got some suggested ones on our pro forma report that you have to do in the exam, but just make sure you tailor it to what's happened in a specific scenario. Focus on what's happened in this particular scenario, because they are sensible action points based on what's happened in the year are what will be included in the recommendations section. So then with the exec summary, so as I've explained, previously, a summary and a conclusion are inherently similar. If you conclude on something, on a subject matter, or if you summarize a subject matter, then obviously, the key points in that subject matter will be in both. So if the subject matter is changes in revenue, cost of revenue, gross profit, EBITDA, and cash, year on year, then obviously the facts of that, are going to be the facts of that, stay the same. So if you conclude on it or if you summarize it, then you're going to have those main key headline points in both. So therefore, as a starting point for your exec summary, you could copy the conclusions over because that's got the main numbers for each section. So you've got all of the main points which you need to have in the exec summary. If you write this from scratch, it would look almost identical anyway. So you can copy that over as a starting point, but then you need to show some skill and precision in deciding on which other points that you want to add into your exec summary. So you kind of start off with your conclusions, but this is going to the directors. So we're not just giving them just the raw points of revenue went up by this, cost of revenue went up by this, gross profit margin improved by X% to X%. We now want to add in some of our further analysis that we did, because remember in the conclusions we've just copied over like the main number. So for example, with revenue, we just said it's kind of gone up by this in the forecast. We've added a few bits on the KPIs, but not all of it. Probably a better example would be gross profit. We just said it's gone up by this to this. But we did some really useful analysis here where we said, well, the reason it's going up is because revenue per transaction increasing faster than cost of revenue per transaction, higher average transaction value, the increased scale, etc. So we haven't got that in the conclusions. We just had a really basic, simple point about it's gone up faster than last year. But what the directors would like to see is some further analysis on the key changes, for example. So overall gross profit margin is something the directors will be particularly interested in and concerned about. Or in this case, it's positive, so therefore they'll be looking to know kind of why that was and how they can increase it further. So in the main body conclusion, we just had gross profit's gone up. But in the exec summary, we can add in more detail explaining how that resulted in a gross profit margin increase and how the commercial reasons behind that because of the higher scale. So therefore we can add in some additional points into our exec summary. In the EBITDA section, we didn't have anything about particular admin costs. So in the conclusion section on EBITDA, we just had a raw point about EBITDA has gone up by X% to X%, but it's still below the forecast. So in the exec summary, we can add in detail about employee costs because we know they've increased significantly. So again, we're not adding more points on, small insignificant amounts like other costs or perhaps IT costs, which hadn't moved quite so significantly. We're adding points on the key headline numbers, so changes in profit margins, significant changes in KPIs, whether targets have been met, an additional point on cash, adding an additional point on the partner issues, the big picture strategic issues that the directors need to be aware of. And you can see that there, in the conclusions, we just had the point that net cash has declined and the number. Whereas in the exec summary, I've added a point explaining about the days that's increased because of the machine learning tool. It's within the limit that presumably the directors have set, but this is increasing. The aim of reducing it is not being met. And with the partner, added on an additional point here. So you can see with the exec summary, it isn't simply a case of, just copying the conclusions, which some people, mistakenly think it is. Your conclusions has just got the main points or a main point for each section so that you've addressed the requirement. In the exec summary, you're starting with that because you'll have like your main points here, but then you're adding in some additional points, so a bit more detail, perhaps on the cash, the change in margins, the KPIs, and then we're also bringing over our most important recommendations, what we think are most pressing and important based on what has happened during the year, because there'll be a few recommendations in the exec summary which are required in order to get the mark. So if we focused on sensible action points based on what's happened during the year, then we should have picked these points up in the recommendation section, and focusing on the most important ones should help us get the mark in the exec summary. Now, some people mistakenly believe that they could copy over all of their requirement one or excessive chunks of it in the hope of making sure they get these specific points. Of course, if you do that, then you won't get the mark here for it being an appropriate summary. So if you follow this approach of having short and concise conclusions, making sure that you're thorough, that you've got a point on each section, so like revenue by region, cost of revenue, gross profit, EBITDA, cash, and the partner issue, just one point on each of those, the main one, key headline point on each of those. You've got nice and concise conclusions. You bring those over into the exec summary, so you've got like the raw headline numbers there, and then you're adding in some additional points on the key areas, the areas of most significant change during the year, and the areas which are most important to directors, so changes in profit margin, significant changes in a particular territory or in a KPI, whether targets have been met. So you can see the real skill that you need there around judgment on deciding which additional points to bring into the exec summary. You could think, copy your conclusions as a starting point, and you've got a little bit of room to add in some more points, because if you add in too many, you won't get this point. So you've got a little bit of room to add in some additional points. So you're just focusing on what those most important points were. You're still taking them from the main body of the report, because they're in an actual report. There shouldn't be anything in the exec summary which isn't in the main body. So, you're not adding any new points, but you're being selective and applying judgment about which points you should add in. But I would say, and lots of students say this, and I agree, that this is probably the hardest part of the requirement, deciding which additional points to add in to the exec summary. And whilst there might be some tricky points elsewhere in requirement one, I don't think there's any boxes that I would look at and think, well, this is really difficult. The request for advice can be quite challenging, but other than that, I think most of the points on requirement one shouldn't be too difficult for you to get, particularly if you've practiced, several mock exams, you've thought about your technique in advance, how you're going to structure your points, the type of points you're going to include in each section, and you go through the exam paper information and make sure you incorporate this new information as much as possible in your answer, then, provided that you do all of that, I think you'll score really well on requirement one. What is perhaps the biggest risk really on requirement one is that you overrun. you spend too long on requirement 1, and therefore that's to the detriment of requirement 2 and 3, and therefore you end up giving up lots of easy marks in requirement 2 and 3 when you've spent too long on requirement 1, probably trying to chase down every single, harder mark. Like I said, if there's some cost, the movement isn't that significant, there's not a reason from the exam paper, you haven't got the time for it, then move on. And therefore, make sure you leave enough time for requirement 2 and 3. But there are plenty of easy marks in there as well. So you want to just make sure you kind of get all the easy and medium marks. And if the request for advice is difficult, or there's some tricky numbers to calculate, or you feel like you need a few more points down for it, but you can't think of any, then move on, because they are some of the harder bits. So you need to show some judgment yourself there in terms of your exam technique, as well as what goes in the exec summary. Show the judgment as to where the easy marks are in the paper, and therefore making sure that you're strict with your timing so that you do move on with time. But all of this will come as you practice more and more mock exams and see different scenarios and keep practicing your exam technique. So requirement 1 overall, fairly standard. You've seen it in earlier exams. The key is your technique. Use that scenario as much as possible. Get through it as quickly as possible to making sure that you leave a sufficient time for requirements 2 and requirements 3.